folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we're going to go through my team selection for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll jump straight into my race week review for Bahrain. A lot to cover in this video. I had 276 points all out in the desert, our second leg of our triple header, and came away with an overall pretty good weekend. Budget gains for all of my assets, maximum price rises for 6 of them. And so looking ahead to Saudi Arabia, what that can look like for more budget gain on the table, what the point scoring landscape can look like. Oscar Piastri, a pretty good weekend from him. Pole position, fastest lap, race winner, 90 points to boot. Pretty content with how all things shook out in that department. Haas drivers, biggest surprise of the weekend for me. Would not have expected 22 from Oliver Bearman to come from P20 all the way into the points, and then Ocon with another 15 points to go along with that. So a great result for the Haas team all up. The constructor as well. I didn't run them, but a lot of people did. I think feasting on the overtakes and positions gain. They've been an absolute juggernaut for fantasy points this season, certainly in China and more recently in Bahrain. Hadjar, 5 points, not too bad. I think he's going, for now to be, again, that kind of set and forget backmarker driver. He's looking really good, single lap pace, exceptional. And I think for the foreseeable can hopefully capitalize on the low thresholds he needs for a price rise. Jack Doohan, 2 points, one short of the maximum price gain. So obviously not ideal. Would have loved to see him go up 0.6, only 0.2 million for him. Didn't even quite hit that 3-point threshold needed, even on the back of Hulkenberg, who was ahead of him being disqualified. So I'm not going to get too caught up about that, but at the same time, would have been nice to see another 0.4 tacked on to the team value. But I think McLaren and Mercedes, the template picks in the constructor department heading into the weekend absolutely delivered. Mercedes could have even been high with Kimi Antonelli sliding back in the final stages of the race. But I think the action-packed Grand Prix, the number of overtakes on the table really made for an exciting spectacle. And I think McLaren aren't going anywhere. Mercedes are doing their part as that second-in-command constructor. And I think it goes to show that most teams that had this kind of template, I think Haas, nothing I'm going to take away from them, but 40 points for a constructor is an outlier. We won't see that every weekend. So although I will say there was maybe some luck, at the same time, people who ran a lineup similar to this or one with Piastri, Russell, McLaren and Haas definitely came out on top this weekend. The ascendancy is with those teams heading into Saudi Arabia. And I think certainly from a team value perspective, we're starting to see the engaged managers who are using budget building to bridge the gap between them and the casual player base. So inside the top 200k, the road to recovery is well and truly on. Would have no doubt been inside the top 50k if not for the Ferrari disqualification in China, but I'm going to try and park that as much as possible in my thinking right now. But yeah, very happy with how the team's looking, and I'm very much excited to see what I can do with team value and the points landscape heading into Saudi Arabia. Weekend notes from Bahrain. I think two obvious constructor and asset conversations is Haas, I've already alluded to, our midfield cash cows. It's proven to be that the last couple of seasons now. Hulkenberg, Magnussen in 2024, Ocon and Bearman in 2025. Ayukamatsu is, I don't know what he's feeding into that car, but it's clearly doing wonders for both of the drivers and the team in general. As I said, 40 points is not going to be a regular occurrence for this team. I think no doubt the fluctuations in the midfield constructor department always going to be much higher. But at the same time, I do think Haas at the moment have proven that they are great value for money. And for the next few weeks, you probably will see more price rises as Bearman and Ocon continue to obviously churn in points. Ferrari, on the other hand, they exceeded the threshold needed for a maximum price rise in Bahrain. Probably didn't see that coming. I thought it might have been another week until we saw them getting 0.3s again. But Leclerc and Hamilton finishing both inside the top 5. No disqualifications, obviously, so it helps their case. And now they've moved past China as part of their 3-race rolling average, so that drops off. And as a result of that, they will be likely to see 0.3 increases every single week. Another thing from Bahrain, overtakes were thick and fast. Everyone was scoring overtakes except for Oscar Piastri, who had a pretty uninterrupted race. I think most people were lucky to come away, or not lucky, but were the benefactors of at least one, if not maybe two drivers in the midfield in their team scoring double-digit fantasy points on the back of these overtakes. It was an extremely entertaining race, certainly even within the first couple of laps. I think the bar had been met or exceeded compared to that absolute snooze fest in Japan. But I do think we won't again be seeing these number of overtakes this time around in Saudi Arabia or in future races. Bahrain is an overtake track. It's always going to be a great racing spectacle, and 130 is certainly above average for most circuits compared to a track like Saudi Arabia, which we probably won't see all that many overtakes because it is much more difficult to drive. Now, on the topic of price changes in in Saudi Arabia, not in Bahrain, there are going to be fewer drivers with a higher likelihood of a maximum price increase. And I think for that reason, our attention maybe diverts towards more of a points focus, not purely points focus, but slightly more of a points focus because of the fact there isn't that much to gain this weekend. Now, I'm going to throw up the budget building tool on the screen here just for you guys to take a look at. As you can see here, Piastri and Russell, the only realistic drivers in the A tier that can potentially reach the maximum price rise. Piastri definitely, I think 31 is within reason for George Russell as well. He's been extremely consistent this year, really liking what I'm seeing from him. In the constructor department, all of the A tiers should rise in price 0.3, and Haas the most likely to go up 0.6 in the B tier. So I think that's an encouraging sign for Haas owners. All 6 constructors actually went up the maximum in Bahrain. Not something we will see all that often, but I think it's an encouraging sign nonetheless for anyone with constructors, which is going to be all of you. In the driver B tier department, I think probably the most interesting of the 4 different price change buckets here, Behrman and Hadjar, the 2 that are most likely to go up in price. I think Behrman, I set and forget for the time being, 7.9 million is probably about what I'd expect him to be, maybe even a little underpriced at the moment. And Hadjar, 6 is not unrealistic for him, but I still think he should finish with positive points, which should be enough for at least some form of a price rise in Saudi Arabia. Beyond that, the waters do get a little murky. Now, I'm not suggesting 8 is impossible for Doohan, 9 is impossible for Alonso, 10 is impossible for Ocon, but it's going to be certainly harder at a low overtake track. And overtakes are, as I've said, fewer and further between in Saudi than they are in Bahrain. I'll just quickly divert you to a chart Adam from Fantasy HQ has prepared. Jeddah is in the bottom half for overtakes in all of the last 3 years on the F1 calendar. 32 overtakes in 2022, 68 in 2023, and then all the way down in 4th lowest with 52 in 2024. For that reason, that's why the argument for Limitless is becoming very much part of the fantasy discourse this time around. And I do want to dive into kind of a little bit, we talked about this on stream before the deadline in Bahrain, what that means for our fantasy teams. I think there's probably more time to talk about it in my final thoughts and preview, but I've got a couple of high-level considerations for going limitless on a non-sprint versus sprint. I think the biggest thing you want to think about, regardless of these points, is the points delta. And using a limitless on a non-sprint weekend, if you can get more than 100 points on non-limitless teams on a non-sprint weekend, compared to only 75 points on a sprint weekend versus non-limitless teams, then using a limitless on a non-sprint weekend is naturally better. It's not just how many points you can score. Sure, sprint weekends give you more points, but if you can get 100 on a non-sprint weekend versus the non-limitless teams versus 75 on a sprint weekend, then the 100 points is going to be putting your team in a better position. But also considering that, another factor in favor of Saudi Arabia is you want drivers in the top teams to score the most points. You don't want midfield drivers obviously stealing points away from top drivers while you're on limitless. And so if a small over or a low overtake track like Saudi Arabia works in that favor. However, to the contrary, you also want a team that's coming off the back of price rises and expected to get more in the limitless weekend, because obviously when you use limitless, you get the price changes of your non-limitless team. I've obviously just showed you the budget building chart. It's not looking too great for building budget in the midfield. Obviously, if you've got Piastri, Mercedes, McLaren, for example, or Piastri, Russell, McLaren, Haas, all of those assets will go up in price. The rest not looking so encouraging. And that's why I'm not so sure. For me, I'm 100% on Limitless in Saudi Arabia. But again, I'm not also 100% on Limitless in Miami. I think other low overtake tracks before the summer break could include Imola. And so that's why I'm not absolutely jumping on it for this weekend or even the next weekend just yet. I think there's merits to both schools of thought, but I think right now the low price thresholds, you really want that. So you've got as many drivers rising in price while you're on Limitless and to capitalize on those budget gains. And for that reason, I might not even be aiming for drivers that will appreciate in value, but drivers like Gabriel Bortoleto that will at least preserve their existing value that weekend. Now, on that topic, Gabriel Bortoleto is one of my transfer targets for this week. 4.5 million and owned by 24%, about stock standard for most drivers in the midfield. The problem for him is he's not a point scoring juggernaut. I wouldn't expect that from many fantasy midfield drivers at the moment, but he's averaging less than 0 points per race, obviously on the back of his, not disqualification, his DNF in Australia. Hasn't really had enough of an opportunity to score many more points since then. He's also only gained 0.8 positions per race. And for that reason, you're not expecting him to change the world in, I guess, the fantasy landscape. The thing is, for me, he's not going to drop in price. That's his biggest benefit right now. 4.5 is the price floor for fantasy assets. If you're looking to preserve value, you want someone like Gabriel Bortoleto in your team. He's a target of mine for the sprint, for the Limitless weekend, whenever that is. Obviously, if I'm activating Limitless in Saudi Arabia, he won't be in my team because you can't transfer drivers in and then activate the Limitless because the transfers will reverse. But if I do go down the path of Limitless in Miami, Bortoleto for me is high on my shopping list for this weekend. On the other hand, Ferrari, not a team, as I've alluded to already, that has had the same consistency we've probably come to expect, almost in the same Bortoleto school of thought, where it's been rubber banding in points. We saw that disqualification in China, but has had two very good results lately to see price increases, the 0.3 most recently in Bahrain. So 27.3, it's not a cheap amount. They're the second highest priced constructor in the game, owned by 22%, but that ownership has dwindled since China. And even though they're not really scoring much in the way of overtakes and positions gained, they have been scoring a lot in the pit stop points department. So they've obviously had their points propped up a little bit by that. And as a top team as well, they're certainly in the conversation for the fastest lap, etc. as well, which goes into the constructor. So I'm not suggesting right now I'm an absolute lock for having them in my team in Saudi Arabia, but I do like the turnaround that they are on at the moment. I'm not suddenly expecting Leclerc or Hamilton to win races, but we saw a glimpse of that potential in China, both top 5 in Bahrain, both experienced drivers coming to Saudi Arabia. So that's why for me, I am looking at potentially swapping them out for someone like Mercedes, should it obviously get to that point. But I think, there's a lot of conversation around price changes, Limitless, chip usage, etc., how that can obviously shake out in F1 Fantasy this weekend. So this is my early team thoughts for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. There's quite a bit of a conversation around, do I Limitless, do I not? I've obviously talked about that a little bit, and I want to kind of pick apart some different options for if I went down non-Limitless this weekend, what that could mean. So I will bring up my fantasy team on screen here for just a second, so you can obviously get an idea of what to do or what you might want to consider for this weekend. So I've obviously emptied out a couple of slots already for my team. In the constructor slot, as you know, Mercedes. In the driver slot, it was Doohan. So for me, perhaps an obvious move would just be to hold Mercedes, bring in someone like Gabby Bortoleto, and just use one transfer. I obviously can't roll a transfer if I'm using Limitless in Miami, but at the same time, I do think this is a nice team for building value. Now, again, kind of going back to the Limitless argument, I probably alluded to that a little bit, but didn't go into it too much in my weekend notes. The overtakes are going to be low in Saudi Arabia. We look, as I said, it was on the chart there, and the point scoring for fantasy fantasy assets is also going to be low in Saudi Arabia. So we had the overtake chart I showed before that Adam had put together earlier this season. I think it's a super useful chart to gauge kind of the upside for fantasy points. Saudi Arabia, as I think, I've also pointed out here and there, no driver scored more than 10 points in 2024 in the midfield. Alonso, I think he's an asset I'm very much considering this weekend, but no driver really scored more than 10 points in the midfield. So a very compelling argument for Limitless, because you obviously want the top 5 drivers most likely to score the most that weekend in your team. You go back to 2023, same again. All of the top drivers in the top teams scored the most points. No one in the midfield broke 10 points. One of the lowest point scoring averages on the calendar, 10.8 points. So you're going, most tracks are above 10 points, certainly in the latter stages of the year. And going again to 2024, the average 9.7 in Saudi Arabia. Most tracks are breaking 10 along the bottom here, if you can follow my cursor. So that's why people are using Limitless this weekend, and why I think there's certainly an argument for going down that track. The thing is, as I've said, the budget gain is not quite there for my team. I think Ocon potentially could fall in price. Doohan, I think, absolutely will fall in price. Hadjar and Behrman for me are the locks. McLaren and Mercedes are the locks. Oscar Piastri is a lock. So if I went down a non-limitless route in Saudi Arabia, I think Fernando Alonso could be, for me, a good option. I know that leaves 5 million on the table. I could bring in Mercedes for a hit, Ferrari for a hit. Do I want to do that? Probably not, but I really like the foundations of this team. Why do I like Alonso in Saudi Arabia? Because if we go back to the statistics here, Alonso 16 points last year, one of the only midfield drivers scoring double-digit fantasy points. He was in obviously a rocket ship back in 2023, but I think the experience around this track is going to be imperative. We only had a couple of DNFs here the last couple of seasons, but in its first 2 seasons on the calendar, 2021 and 2022, we were averaging 6 DNFs per race. Do I want to be carrying a team, if I went down this path, if I was to say leave Jack Doohan in, do I want to be running 4 rookies in Saudi Arabia? We saw how badly that shook out in Australia. I'm not so sure I want to do that. I'd obviously have Mercedes in there if I went down that path, but I'm not so sure for me that's what I want to really be doing. So I think Jack, for that reason, I'm not looking like I'm going to be needing multiple transfers this weekend, but that's probably the 2 slots that I'm most thinking about this weekend if I chose obviously not to go down Ferrari. The thing is, if I did keep Jack, I don't have enough. Even if I got in Bortoletto, oh no, I could do that. It would be if I took Jack Doohan out, because if I wanted to keep Ocon in, his price, he's gone up in value every single race this season, Esty Bestie. And so like 9.3, I don't have enough to get in Bortoletto. If I could, I probably would go this lineup, Ferrari and Ocon and then Bortoletto in this slot. I can't reach it. Some of you might be able to. I think that's certainly an option. Now, if we were looking at teams with Haas in the second constructor slot, I think going to be another popular option for that price gain upside. I don't have the budget, once again, surprise, surprise, to get in. I could do that. I could have George Russell in here, and then I could drop in Bortoletto. If I had something like this. Again, this for me would be a hit, so I'm probably less inclined to do that. I could do it in 2 moves. I wouldn't obviously have enough to keep Esteban Ocon, so I think you could do something like that too. I love George Russell, as I said, price gain upside, but I do think there's probably a world in which if you didn't want to do Esty Bestie, Fernando Alonso fits in that slot perfectly fine as well. So I like Alonso. Again, like I said, going back to the budget builder, there's not a lot of drivers that are going to appreciate in value. It's budget mitigation this weekend, which is why for me, I'm not so sure Limitless is the right chip for me. Yes, you'll get price increases from Piastri, McLaren, Mercedes, but they're not the ones that have the $0.6 million increases. You want to have those weekends, and I think it's somewhat of a luck-based outcome. You obviously want to have those B-tier drivers coming off big weekends, which are going to propel their threshold below 0 or close to 0, as opposed to having to reach double-digit fantasy scores at a low overtake, low point scoring track for the midfield. So that's why I'm kind of less inclined to go down that route. But that's kind of what my team is looking at right now. I'll be back with my final thoughts later in the week. But as always, guys, let me know down in the comments below what you're running and how you did in Bahrain. Have a great rest of your day. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.